Hello. It's the early hours, so I'm not going to speak too loud, but I want to speak a bit about the issue of racism, and a specific type of racism. Obviously all racism is despicable, but this is a specific type of racism. Let's call it a root-based racism. I'll try and explain what I mean by that. I find that a lot of hostility to others is based on a notion of victimhood. And I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm saying in this without automatically jumping to conclusions. Please just listen carefully, and I hope you can get what I'm trying to say here, because I think it's very, very important. I find that a lot of the racism in the world, whether it be white supremacy or black supremacy or Asian supremacy, isn't actually so much based on supremacy as a notion of victimhood. We are the oppressed people. This can partly be explained by the fact that throughout history there are many examples of subjugation and persecution and imperialism. And as a white guy, I fully admit that predominantly white countries were largely guilty of that in historical terms. When we think of the British Empire, the French Empire, the Spanish Empire, and when we think of centuries of colonialism and subjugation, predominantly white nations have a lot to answer for. I don't want to use the term white nations because that obviously doesn't refer to today when we have multicultural societies, but I'm talking in the historical context. But that in itself is misleading, to suggest that all white people, that's part of the history of all white people. I mean, the Irish are white, and Irish nationalism would certainly portray itself as the victims of British imperialism. There's many parts of Eastern Europe would consider themselves subjugated by a Russian imperialism, Soviet imperialism to be more precise, and they're largely white. So there's persecution within white, predominantly white communities' history. This is an entirely historical context I'm talking about, because we live in an interconnected world and societies nowadays are a lot more diverse, so I'm talking in historical terms. So that's the first thing I would like to clear up. The idea that whilst predominantly white countries have been guilty of a lot of this behaviour, there have also been white people who have been victims of other white people, so to speak. But what I find is that there's that supremacist mentality, but there's also a notion of victimhood that is, and sometimes people guilty of racism use history as an excuse. One thing I will say, absolutely, I believe anyone is capable of racism. I don't buy for 1 second, and I don't accept for 1 second, that someone cannot be a racist because they're black or Asian or Hispanic. The idea that only white people are capable of racism is beyond crap. And I'll say that point blank, and I've got a conviction about that. Because to suggest that other ethnic groups cannot be capable of racism is almost to suggest that they are not human. And the fact of the matter is, any human being can be capable of that form of ignorance. It's a fact. As far as I'm concerned, if you judge other people based solely on the colour of their skin, if you actively discriminate against them, if you actively hate them, you are by definition a racist. And what I want to talk about in this video is people who use history as an excuse for their own bullshit attitude. I've just seen a video, actually, this is partly the context I'm making this, in Hawaii, and there was a guy verbally abusing a white woman, saying he hates white people, and I have to say, I don't know the whole context of the video, and I also have to say there were a lot of native Hawaiians on that video saying the guy was a dickhead and he didn't represent them. This is something I've heard about in Hawaii, and by the way, if you're from Hawaii, please hear me out. I'm not trying to insult Hawaii, I'm just saying that this is the context that I'm speaking in. I have heard that there is a sort of historical attitude in Hawaii that because, I mean, Hawaii was annexed by the mainland United States, I believe, in 1893. The monarch was overthrown, so there is still historical resentment in Hawaii, akin, I guess, to Native Americans. My logic is that history should be acknowledged, and the wrongs of history should be acknowledged, but it is never ever an excuse to hate somebody who has done nothing to you. So, for example, because historically speaking there were wrongs against the native people of Hawaii, it doesn't justify Hawaiians today then hating outsiders. And I have no doubt that most Hawaiians are decent, normal people who don't behave like that guy. In fact, some people were suggesting he isn't even a native Hawaiian. But, you know, I don't want people to think of picking on Hawaii. I'm just using that as an example. There's many, many, many other examples. It would be like if a Chinese person hates all Japanese because of what Imperial Japan done in the war. And I have actually been in a few debates with Chinese people I'm connected with when they have come out with not necessarily hateful comments, but sort of they have said things about Japan as a whole country. And I've sort of said, well, you know, Japanese children aren't responsible for what their ancestors done. And the reason this gets ridiculous is if you want to get really academic about it, then technically pretty much everyone in the world would have a cause to have a grievance about pretty much everyone else, or almost everyone else. I mean, myself as a British person, if we're going to be really academic about it, should I then have a hostility towards Danes because Vikings plundered the region that I'm living in 800 years ago? Actually 1,000 years ago? No, of course not. That would be ridiculous. Okay, granted that some of the other examples I've spoken about are much more recent, and I also think it doesn't help if governments don't acknowledge their wrongs. That is another reason why it's so critical that all governments in the world acknowledge the wrongs of their country. So I do think it's important that Japan acknowledge its past. Just as an example, I think it's right that European countries acknowledge the wrongs committed in the name of colonialism. I'm from the United Kingdom. I believe my country, we were right to acknowledge that what we done at Amritsar in India was absolutely abhorrent. And we were guilty of many, many other things. I'm going to say it here and now, the British Empire was covered in blood. There's no escaping that fact because it's just a fact. So every government has to acknowledge whatever country it's representing, the moral wrongs that that country has been guilty of. But it just depresses me and frankly pisses me off that there are people who use history as an excuse to hate others because of what your people done to my people. It's bullshit. It's just a really shitty, narrow-minded mentality. Because when you see the world through what group people belong to, then you're not seeing people as individuals, and it's just a very, to me, it's a very narrow mentality. Yes, you can be angry about historical injustices. I completely understand that, and I've no problem with that. You know, you wouldn't be human if you read about injustice in history and didn't have some emotions about it. But what I do have a problem with is people who use that as an excuse to hate outsiders because their ancestors done something wrong. That's just a phony mentality. Now, if there's present injustices going on, that's a different matter. So if there's still evident subjugation of some sort going on, then I can understand some degree of hostility. But if it's just a case that you're hating somebody because of what their ancestors done, then frankly you're pathetic. I really think it is a bullshit mentality to have. And you know, as a white guy, I'm the first to acknowledge the many, 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 many terrible things that were done by predominantly white countries. But hell will freeze over before I apologise personally, because I'm not personally responsible. I have a responsibility as a human being to be honest about history and to condemn that. But if I go to a part of the world, for example, that's suffered subjugation at the hands of the British Empire, and let's say a local gives me a hard time, I'm not going to take it. I'm going to say, fuck you, I'm a tourist, I'm contributing to your country's economy, and I'm not going to be treated badly because of what my ancestors done. So there's a lot of issues here, and I like to hear people's thoughts on this. Personally, I don't think there's any justification for any adult person to have a prejudice against someone based on what their ancestors done. Yes, I can understand anger at history. Or even, you know what, if we're going to say, okay, the prejudice is understandable, at least let it be private. At least don't act on it, because when you have someone harassing someone else or attacking someone else in some cases because they don't like the colour of their skin, it's bullshit. It really is. It makes me very angry, actually, that people could have such a narrow outlook. And to me, the very epitome of racism is treating someone differently solely because of their skin tone, or their, I should say, their skin pigmentation, or their nationality. You know, if you don't like something that a particular group has done, then that's fine. But don't demonize every single member of that group, because it is an incredibly narrow outlook. That's all I have to say. To me, that is the epitome of racism. Let me know your thoughts. And preferably I'd like responses from people from a wide variety of backgrounds. Just for the record, I'm not picking on any one region or place or whatever. I would just use those places as examples. But there's many, many, many other examples. Let me know your thoughts.